September 14, 1944, 0630 hours. A German prisoner transport truck rattled through the dusty road leading into a sprawling American camp in Louisiana. The weary Wehrmacht soldiers, uniforms still caked with mud from the French countryside, were silent, expecting the worst. They had been captured during the Allied push through Normandy, and the tales whispered among the ranks were grim. Beatings, starvation, humiliation. Through the barbed wire fence, one of them spotted something bizarre. A long line of prisoners, not starving, not beaten, but calmly holding steaming tin mugs. The unmistakable smell drifted over the camp. It wasn't soup, it wasn't porridge, it was coffee. Hot, dark, and endless. What these German soldiers didn't know was that for Americans, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was fuel. And soon, the POWs would discover a luxury even many civilians back in Europe hadn't seen in years: unlimited coffee every single day. The camp gates clanged shut behind them. Inside, the Germans were marched past rows of barracks, each neatly ordered. To their surprise, the men already inside didn't look broken. Some waved, some smirked knowingly, as if to say, "You'll see soon enough." The new arrivals were herded toward the mess hall, and that's when they saw it. Giant steel percolators bubbling with gallons of fresh coffee. American guards ladled it into tin mugs without hesitation, refilling anyone who asked. No ration cards, no limits, just coffee, given freely. For men who had marched through France on nothing but watery soup and black bread, the experience was almost surreal. One German later wrote in his diary, "I thought I had entered paradise. The Americans gave us coffee as though it were water." To understand why German POWs were so stunned, you need to know what coffee meant to an American soldier. By 1944, coffee wasn't just a comfort. It was an essential part of military culture. Rations might run short on meat, vegetables, or even bread. But coffee? Never. The U.S. Army made sure every soldier had access to it, no matter where they were stationed. Soldiers joked that coffee kept the war machine running. One famous quip went, "The United States Army runs on beans and bullets." Coffee beans, that is. Each GI's daily ration included instant coffee packets, sugar, and powdered cream. In foxholes, men brewed it over small stoves. On transport ships, massive urns churned it out day and night. Even in combat zones, commanders ensured hot coffee reached the front lines whenever possible. It was more than caffeine, it was morale. Soldiers could lose faith in the mission, despair in mud and blood, but the simple act of holding a steaming mug reminded them of home, of mothers, wives, and diners back in Ohio or Kansas. Coffee became a ritual, one the Germans quickly realized was sacred to their captors. For the German prisoners, this abundance bordered on absurd. Back in the Reich, coffee had long since disappeared from civilian life. Real beans were nearly impossible to find after 1941. Most Germans drank ersatz, bitter substitutes made from roasted barley, chicory, or even ground acorns. To suddenly find themselves in a camp where Americans poured endless cups of the real thing, without question, without limits, was like stepping into another world. One prisoner later recalled, "At first I thought it was a trick. Surely they would stop after one cup, but they didn't. They came and poured more, smiling. It was the first time I truly realized we had lost the war." The mess hall buzzed with the clatter of tin trays as the new German arrivals filed inside. At the end of the line, steam rose from enormous percolators, tall as barrels, tended by American cooks who seemed in no rush. One guard, cigarette dangling from his lip, casually filled mugs and cast them down. The aroma filled the air. Some of the German prisoners hesitated, gripping their empty cups with uncertainty. Then, with a shrug, one stepped forward. The hot liquid poured in, dark and inviting. He raised it to his lips and froze. This was no ersatz, no bitter chicory or acorn sludge. This was real coffee, strong, rich, with the bite of roasted beans they hadn't tasted in years. His eyes widened. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he smiled. Soon the hall was filled with the sound of mugs clinking, men muttering in disbelief. "Noch ein? Another?" The guards simply nodded and refilled. Some Germans drank too quickly, the shock of hot liquid warming empty stomachs. Others savored every sip, staring into the black surface as if trying to remember life before the war. For many, this single act,
being handed endless coffee by their supposed enemies became a defining memory of captivity. It was more than a beverage, it was proof that America's wealth, even in wartime, seemed limitless. One prisoner later wrote in a letter home, "We are treated not like dogs, but like men. Today they gave us coffee, and we may drink as much as we want. At home, even the officers' mess could not provide such things anymore. Here, it flows like water." What the Germans didn't realize at first was that America's coffee wasn't just kindness, it was culture, even strategy. To the U.S. Army, keeping prisoners alive, healthy, and even comfortable was part of a larger message. America had so much abundance, it could share luxuries even with its enemies. In contrast, German POW camps were infamous for starvation and cruelty. The difference wasn't lost on the prisoners. Some historians argue that the endless coffee and plentiful food in U.S. camps was a form of psychological warfare. It reminded the German prisoners every day that America had resources beyond imagination, while the Reich was collapsing under shortages and hunger. American guards joked about it too. A sergeant at Camp Swift, Texas, once said, "If coffee doesn't break them, nothing will. They'll see we've got rivers of the stuff." And indeed, many German prisoners later admitted that the generosity of food and drink in American camps shook their confidence in the Nazi propaganda machine. Berlin had called them Americans were ruthless, decadent, and disparate. Yet here they were, sitting in neat barracks, drinking unlimited coffee, while their families back home rationed bread and dreamed of ersatz substitutes. Coffee thus became a subtle weapon, not fired from rifles, but poured into mugs. Every cup carried a message. America wasn't just fighting Germany on the battlefield, it was defeating them in culture, in industry, in spirit. To the prisoners, the coffee proved something their officers never admitted. The war was unwinnable against such power. By October 1944, the routine inside most American-run POW camps was firmly established. The Germans woke to the clang of a morning bell, lined up in orderly fashion, and marched toward the mess halls. Breakfast was simple: bread, oatmeal, sometimes eggs, but the star of every meal was always present: coffee. The percolators bubbled before sunrise, and cooks ensured that no cup went empty. Many prisoners came to depend on that steaming mug as the one constant in their otherwise uncertain new life. It wasn't long before coffee drinking became a ritual. In the barracks, men gathered after work details, cradling tin mugs and sharing stories. The smell alone lifted morale. Some tried to barter extra bread for second helpings of sugar to sweeten their drink. Others hoarded powdered creamer as if it were gold. Letters home described the experience with disbelief. "I drink more coffee here in 1 week than I drank in the last 2 years in Germany," one POW confessed. Over time, the unlimited coffee became symbolic. The prisoners began to realize that their captors didn't treat them as faceless enemies. Guards sometimes joined them, sitting shoulder to shoulder, sipping from the same urn. Language barriers broke down over refills. For a moment, the war seemed far away. The prisoners were not soldiers of Hitler or enemies of America. They were simply men, united by something as small yet powerful as a mug of hot coffee. To fully understand why this shocked German POWs, one must remember what their own country offered to captives. In German-run POW camps across Europe, Allied prisoners were subjected to meager rations: watery cabbage soup, a slice of stale bread, perhaps a scrap of horse meat if they were lucky. Coffee? If it existed at all, it was ersatz, burnt barley, chicory, or acorn mixtures, bitter enough to curl the tongue. In Stalag camps, men joked grimly that the ersatz brew was so foul it could strip rust off metal. The difference was staggering. American POW camps, even at their most basic, provided calories far above what Germans expected. By late 1944, U.S. camps averaged over 3,000 calories a day per prisoner. In contrast, German rations for Allied captives often fell below 1,200 calories, barely enough to survive. And while Germans enforced strict scarcity, Americans practiced abundance. Where Germans doled out rations with suspicion, Americans poured coffee freely. No ledger, no restrictions. The psychological impact was immense. To the German prisoners, it wasn't just about taste, it was about dignity. They had been captured, disarmed, and confined, but with each cup, they were reminded that their captors had the power to crush them, yet chose instead to overwhelm them with generosity. One German officer later reflected, "It was not the guards' rifles that broke our pride. It was the coffee, given without demand, that showed us how hopeless our war truly was."
By 1944, German prisoners were just sitting idle behind fences. Thousands were assigned to labor details across the United States, farms, lumber mills, canneries, and even military supply depots. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to work, provided it wasn't directly for the war effort. And so, across the American countryside, German soldiers found themselves harvesting cotton in Texas, picking fruit in California, or cutting timber in the Midwest. Yet even here, coffee followed them. American supervisors treated the POWs much like they treated civilian workers. Shifts were broken by regular pauses, and on nearly every break, steaming urns of coffee appeared. For the Germans, it was astonishing. To be marched out into the fields in the morning as captives, only to be handed hot coffee at midday by their guards, blurred the line between prisoner and laborer. They began to joke among themselves that Americans must have lakes of coffee hidden somewhere underground. Some POWs even earned wages, scrip, or tokens that could be exchanged at camp canteens. And what was always stocked, often in abundance? Coffee, along with cigarettes, chocolate, and other luxuries. Men who had been hardened by years of war now found themselves bargaining for extra cups or saving tokens to buy tins they could drink late into the night. To them, coffee breaks weren't just about caffeine. They were a daily reminder that they were no longer in Hitler's Europe, but in a land of impossible plenty. For many German soldiers, the endless supply of coffee in America was their first glimpse into a cultural divide far wider than the Atlantic Ocean. They came from a nation where scarcity defined everyday life by 1944. Civilians lined up for hours for scraps of bread. Ersatz products filled store shelves. Even officers' messes cut corners as the war dragged on. Meanwhile, in America, prisoners, men who had once tried to kill their captors, drank real coffee freely, day after day, as if the war didn't exist. This abundance bewildered them. Prisoners wrote home describing not just the coffee, but the philosophy it seemed to represent. One man said, "In Germany, we are told the Americans are decadent and weak. But here I see the truth. They are so wealthy they give their enemies more than we can give our own soldiers." For many, this realization struck harder than any battlefield defeat. If America could spare unlimited coffee for prisoners, what else could it do for its armies? The cultural shock was profound. Some Germans began questioning the very foundation of Nazi propaganda. The Reich had told them America was crumbling under debt, strikes, and shortages. Yet here they sat, in clean camps, sipping coffee until their hands shook, while their families in Hamburg or Berlin boiled acorns to make ersatz brews. The contrast gnawed at them. Every sip of coffee became an unspoken reminder Germany could not win against such abundance.
By 1945, America's POW network stretched from New England to the Deep South. from the plains of Kansas to the pine forests of Louisiana. Roughly 425,000 German prisoners lived inside barbed wire fences, but few of them went hungry, and fewer still went without coffee. Camp commanders quickly realized that hot drinks weren't just about comfort, they were about control. A pot of coffee in the mess hall could calm restless men, quiet arguments, and soften resentments. Guards knew it too. A cup of steaming coffee handed across the chow line could do more to maintain order than a dozen rifles pointed at the wire. Letters and diaries recovered after the war reveal how deeply this small ritual shaped German memories of captivity. Many POWs wrote not about punishment or cruelty, but about the smell of coffee drifting through wooden barracks on cold mornings. Some admitted that it was in those moments, sitting with a cup in their hands, talking with fellow prisoners, that they began to see Americans not as enemies, but as people. The bitterness of the brew mingled with the bitterness of defeat, yet it carried with it an unexpected sweetness, dignity preserved through hospitality. Coffee, in the end, became a bridge. It made the impossible, life as a captive in a foreign land, something that could be endured. And for thousands of men, it planted the first seeds of a different future, one where they might eventually see America not as the enemy, but as a nation worth understanding. When the war finally ended, ships and trains carried German POWs back across the Atlantic. Many returned to cities reduced to rubble, families broken by bombings, and a homeland exhausted by years of total war. Yet one detail appeared again and again in their stories: coffee. Former prisoners told neighbors and families about the endless cups they'd received in America. For civilians who had endured years of ersatz, the tales seemed almost mythic, that a defeated soldier, captured on the battlefield, could sit in a prison camp in Texas or Iowa and drink real coffee every single day. Historians later called this the coffee paradox. For the United States, it was a small luxury, scarcely noticed in a nation that consumed half the world's supply. But for German POWs, it became a defining memory, as sharp as the sight of B-17s over Berlin or the roar of tanks at Kursk. In their minds, coffee came to symbolize not just abundance, but the industrial and cultural power that had crushed the Third Reich. To this day, memoirs and interviews with surviving POWs often linger on this detail. They may forget the names of every camp they passed through, but they rarely forget the coffee. The unlimited supply seemed to them like an allegory. America's strength wasn't only in its bombers, tanks, and fleets. It was in the fact that it could afford to treat its enemies better than Germany could treat its own citizens. The taste of defeat, for many, came mixed with the aroma of coffee.